Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Daily Kaylee and the 13 Days of Halloween series. Today's episode is about Gypsy Rose Blanchard and the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard. I'm sure a lot of us have heard about this case, especially because of The Act, which came on Hulu a few years ago, and it was a reenactment of this case. This case is absolutely insane. If you have somehow never heard of this case, you are in for a wild ride. So, first things first, on June 14th, 2015, a deputy in Greene County, Missouri, found the body of Claudine Blanchard, aka Dee Dee, and her body was face down in the bedroom of her house, which was just outside Springfield, Missouri. She was laying in the bed in a pool of her own blood from multiple stab wounds, and she had died multiple days prior. There was no sign of her daughter, Gypsy Rose. According to Dee Dee, Gypsy Rose had multiple chronic conditions, including leukemia, asthma, and muscular dystrophy. She also had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old due to brain damage from being born prematurely. Let's rewind a little bit and get into Dee Dee's backstory and the upbringing of Gypsy Rose. So Dee Dee, like I said, born Claudine, she grew up in Louisiana in 1967. She was one of 5 children. A lot of her relatives recall that even as a child, she had a habit of stealing from her family members. And it seemed that she would steal from them as a way to retaliate when she didn't get her way. She followed a short-lived career as a nurse's aide, and in 1997, when Dee Dee was 30, her family expressed suspicion that she may have killed her own mother by denying her food when she worked as a nurse's aide. When she was 24 years old, she got pregnant by a man named Rod Blanchard, who was only 17. They gave birth to a girl in 1991 named Gypsy Rose. Before Gypsy was even born, her and Rod had separated because Rod believed he had only married Dee Dee for the wrong reasons. So, Gypsy never grew up in a 2-parent household. Before she was even born, her mom was on her own. Dee Dee begged him to come back. He refused, so she took her newborn daughter to live with her family. According to Rod, Gypsy's father, he was still somewhat involved with Gypsy Rose. And he says that by the time Gypsy was 3 months old, her mom was already convinced that she had sleep apnea, like there was something wrong with her. So she would take her to the hospital for overnight stays where they would use a sleep monitor and run tests on Gypsy Rose to see if she had this condition. After this, well, first of all, I should say she did not have sleep apnea. There was absolutely no sign that she had any sleep disorder. But after this, Dee Dee was convinced that Gypsy had a wide range of health issues. And she thought that all of these health issues stemmed from a chromosomal disorder. As a young child, Dee Dee claimed that Gypsy had muscular dystrophy and made her use a walker. In Gypsy's own statement as an adult, she said that when she was 7 or 8, she was riding on her grandfather's motorcycle when they were involved in a very minor accident, and she said she had a scrape on her knee. Dee Dee told Gypsy that the doctors had given her a wheelchair and she would need to use it for her scraped knee. Of course, this is not what Dee Dee told everyone else. Gypsy would go with Rod and Dee Dee to Special Olympics events. In 2001, when Gypsy was 10, her mother was claiming that she was still 8 years old, and she was named the honorary queen of the crew of Mid-City, which was a parade for children, which was held during Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Gypsy did not step foot in a public school after the 2nd grade. The reports are a little foggy, but possibly even as early as kindergarten, she stopped going to school. Dee Dee homeschooled her after that. And according to Dee Dee, her reasoning behind this was because her illnesses were just so severe, she needed to be with her mother at all times. However, it is now believed that this was an attempt to isolate Gypsy from any suspicions that may arise, and also just to further her abuse and keep her isolated so she would not, get the balls to fight back, I guess. Gypsy had to teach herself how to read, and she did this by reading the Harry Potter books. They helped her learn how to read, and that says a lot, just right there, that she had to teach herself how to read. So, Gypsy's father, Rod, he remarried. So, around this point is when she stopped seeing her father as often as she did, because he was moving on, and Dee Dee didn't like that. After he got remarried, Dee Dee moved her and Gypsy in with Dee Dee's father and stepmother. After Dee Dee and Gypsy moved out, her parents would claim that when she was preparing food, she would poison her stepmother's food with Roundup weed killer. And this led to Dee Dee's stepmother having a chronic illness during the time that she lived there. Also, while they lived there, she was arrested for several minor offenses, including writing bad checks. Her parents would regularly confront her about the way she treated Gypsy, and they were suspicious about her role in her stepmother's declining health. It was very weird. After this, she left with Gypsy, and they began living in New Orleans. After they moved out, her stepmother returned to normal. Also, very suspicious. In New Orleans, Dee Dee and Gypsy lived in public housing, and they paid their bills with child support payments that Rod made. They also received public assistance because of Gypsy's medical conditions. They spent a lot of their time visiting various specialists, and they were seeking treatment for all of these illnesses that Dee Dee said that Gypsy had. At this point, she now said Gypsy also had hearing and vision problems. The doctors at the Children's Hospital of New Orleans performed a muscle biopsy on Gypsy and found no sign of muscular dystrophy. She was fine, even though Dee Dee insisted she had it. Other than this, she was able to successfully get treatment for Gypsy's other supposed issues. She also told the doctors that Gypsy would have seizures every few months, and they prescribed Gypsy with anti-seizure medication. Gypsy had several surgeries, and Dee Dee was also regularly taking her to the emergency room for minor incidents. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Dee Dee and Gypsy left their apartment for a shelter in Covington, Louisiana, which was set up specifically for individuals with special needs. Dee Dee told the shelter that Gypsy's medical records, including her birth certificate, had all been destroyed in the flooding. A doctor that was there at the shelter suggested that they relocate her to Missouri, which is where Dee Dee was from. The next month, they were airlifted there. This is when shit goes south, more than it already was. So, at first, Dee Dee and Gypsy lived in a home that they rented in Aurora, which was in the southwestern area of Missouri. During their time there, Gypsy was honored by the Olay Foundation, which is a foundation that advocates for the rights of feeding tube recipients, and she was honored as the 2007 Child of the Year. The following year, in 2008, Habitat for Humanity built them a small home with a wheelchair ramp and a hot tub in Springfield, Missouri, and they moved there. Their story was very juicy for this town. It obviously caught a lot of attention. It was a single mom with a severely disabled daughter, They had been through a hurricane and had nothing, so the community was enamored by them, and they would often pitch in to help her. At this point, Dee Dee had changed her name. She was no longer Claudine Peter. She was now Claudinia Blanchard, but they all knew her as Dee Dee. All of the support that they received in Missouri, not only did it come from their neighbors and community members, but it came from a lot of charities as well. They got all kinds of free stays in the Ronald McDonald houses because of their medical appointments. They would receive free flights to see doctors at a children's hospital in Kansas City. They got free trips to Disney World. They would get backstage passes to Miranda Lambert concerts from Make-A-Wish. And then, of course, they also received child support payments. On Gypsy's 18th birthday, Rod called to wish her happy birthday, and Dee Dee specifically told him not to mention how old she was, and said that because of her disabilities, Gypsy believed she was 14 and it would upset her. At this point, Rod had not seen his daughter. He was only allowed to call her. According to Rod, him and his new wife regularly would try to visit Gypsy in Springfield, but for a bunch of different reasons, Dee Dee would change plans. There was always something that would come up. Dee Dee, on top of doing this, told her neighbors that her Gypsy Rose's father was an abusive drug addict, he was an alcoholic, and that he never sent them any money or had anything to do with them, and that he had never come to terms with Gypsy Rose's health issues. So basically, it was a pity party for her because all of these issues were stuck on her. Obviously, everyone who met Gypsy Rose loved her. She was super charming, super cute. She was only 5 foot tall. She had a nearly toothless mouth, large glasses, and a high, childlike voice. And all of these things reinforced the idea that she definitely had all of these problems because she was such a sweet girl, and it was so sad it couldn't have happened to a nicer person. And she was also just very childlike. She was very sheltered. So of course she was. Gypsy would often wear wigs or hats to cover her baldness. Everyone else thought that Gypsy Rose was bald because of chemotherapy. However, her mother would shave her head regularly, and she would tell Gypsy Rose that the reason that she was shaving her head was because her medication would eventually cause her hair to fall out anyway, so they might as well shave it in advance. Whenever they would leave the house, Dee Dee would bring an oxygen tank and a feeding tube with them. Gypsy was fed Pediasure into her 20s through a feeding tube. Dee Dee used physical abuse to control Gypsy and to keep her complacent. Apparently, she would always hold Gypsy's hand in the presence of others, and whenever Gypsy said something that suggested there was something else going on, or said something that seemed too smart for someone with her mental capabilities, Gypsy said that her mom would squeeze her hand very tightly to warn her, and that when they were alone, Dee Dee would strike her with open hands or a coat hanger. Dee Dee eventually had Gypsy's saliva glands treated with Botox and then extracted altogether to control her drooling. And Gypsy later claimed that the reason she drooled so much is because before doctor visits, Dee Dee would numb her gums with an anesthetic to make her drool uncontrollably. After having her saliva glands extracted, as well as the anti-seizure medication, she had very few teeth. A lot of them had fallen out, and the rest of them were decaying badly. At this point, the majority of her front teeth were extracted. She also had tubes put in her ears because she supposedly had so many ear infections. Only one doctor throughout this entire case was suspicious of Dee Dee. There are others that claimed to be suspicious, but he was the only one who said something about it. Bernardo Flasterstein, I hope I'm saying that correctly, he was a pediatric neurologist, and he saw Gypsy in Springfield. He was suspicious of her muscular dystrophy diagnosis. He ordered MRIs and blood tests, and he found nothing out of the ordinary. He told Dee Dee, "I don't see any reason why she doesn't walk." And he had seen Gypsy stand and support her own weight while being transferred between the wheelchair and the exam table. Flasterstein also said that Dee Dee was not a good historian. He contacted Gypsy's doctors in New Orleans and learned that, as he suspected, her original muscle biopsy had come back negative, so she did not have muscular dystrophy. However, Dee Dee was still telling doctors that she did have it, and then saying that all of her medical records had been destroyed by flooding, so they kind of had to take her word for it. At this point, he suspected that Dee Dee had Munchausen syndrome by proxy. I hope I said that correctly. Anyways, after he called her out on her bullshit, she stopped taking Gypsy to see him. However, whatever he may have done, could have done better, he did not follow up on this at all. He did not report Dee Dee to anyone, and he kind of left it alone. He said that he had been told by other doctors to treat the pair with golden gloves, and he and the other doctors doubted that the authorities would believe their story anyways. In 2009, an anonymous caller told the police about how Dee Dee was using different names and birth dates for both herself and her daughter, and they suggested that Gypsy was in better health than they believed. Officers did a wellness check, obviously, and they accepted Dee Dee's explanation for everything. She said that she used different names and birth dates to make it harder for her ex-husband to find her and Gypsy because he was abusive. They did not talk to Rod to confirm her story, and they also reported that Gypsy did seem to be mentally disabled, so the file was closed. It all checked out. Dee Dee has forged multiple copies of Gypsy's birth certificate. She also moved her birthday to 1995 so that she could keep Gypsy a teenager. Gypsy said later in an interview that she did not know her real age for 15 years. Dee Dee often claimed that the original birth certificate had been destroyed in the flooding, blah, blah, blah. However, Dee Dee did have one copy with Gypsy's actual birthday, and Gypsy recalls seeing it during one of their hospital visits, except she was very confused. Dee Dee told Gypsy it was a misprint, which I don't think that happens very often, but especially for 4 years, but whatever. Anyways, since 2001, when Gypsy was 10, she'd attended these science fiction and fantasy conventions. She loved it. And she would wear costumes because she could blend in and hide her wheelchair, and she looked great. At an event in 2011, when Gypsy was 20 years old, she may have made an escape attempt. We're not really sure if that was her plan or if her escape plan came up after. But her mother found her in a hotel room with a man she had met online. Dee Dee pulled up her birth certificate, quote unquote, and showed her fake-ass birthday and then threatened to call the police because this man was over the age of 18, which, I mean, so was Gypsy, but he didn't know that. After this, Gypsy said that Dee Dee smashed her computer with a hammer and threatened to do the same thing to her fingers if she ever tried to escape again. After this, she kept Gypsy leashed and handcuffed to her bed for 2 weeks. Dee Dee also told Gypsy that she had filed paperwork with the police claiming that Gypsy was indeed mentally incompetent. So therefore, Gypsy believed that if she attempted to go to the police for help, they would not believe her and would send her back home. Sometime in 2012, Gypsy made contact online with a man named Nicholas Gojon. She would continue to use the internet after her mother had gone to bed because that was the only safe time she could do these things. Nicholas Gojon was a man around her age from Big Bend, Wisconsin, and she said they met on a Christian singles group. Nicholas was a sketchy character, and he had a criminal record for indecent exposure. He also had a history of mental illness, and he had autism. In 2014, Gypsy confided in her 23-year-old neighbor, Aaliyah Woodmansey. She was really close to Aaliyah. She looked up to her. However, Aaliyah thought that she was like a big sister figure to Gypsy. She had no clue that they were literally the same age. But Gypsy confided in her. She trusted her. She liked her. And she told Aaliyah that her and Nicholas had discussed eloping and had chosen names for their children, blah, 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 all the romantic stuff. Gypsy had 5 separate Facebook accounts so that she would not be caught by Dee Dee. And her and Nicholas would flirt online, and it was love at first sight. Well, at first chat, I guess. Aaliyah tried to talk her out of it because, like I said, she thought Gypsy was still young, and she thought she might have been taken advantage of by this online predator. But she also thought that Gypsy's plans were just fantasies and dreams, and like she can't really do these things because she's so sick, and she's going to be with her mom forever. So she's like, whatever, it's just a fantasy, it's not going to hurt anyone. Gypsy remained in contact with Nicholas until 2014. Even though, like I said, Dee Dee tried to prevent her from using the internet, she'd smash her devices, she remained in contact with this man. The next year, in 2013, Gypsy paid for Nicholas to come meet her mom in Springfield. Her plan was that he would bump into them while she and Dee Dee were at a movie theater, and they would strike up a conversation, and then they would start a relationship. Like, this was just a random coincidence that they would meet at the movie theater. As soon as they did meet in person for the first time, Nicholas says that Gypsy led him to the bathroom where they had sex at the movie theater. They continued their interactions on the internet, they continued their relationship, and they began developing their plan to kill Dee Dee. In June of 2015, Nicholas returned to Springfield. He arrived in town while Gypsy and Dee Dee were away at a doctor's appointment, and after they had returned home, they waited for Dee Dee to fall asleep. After she went to bed, Gypsy let him into the home and gave him duct tape, gloves, and a knife. And she knew that he was going to use it to murder Dee Dee. That was the understanding they had. Gypsy reportedly hid in the bathroom and covered her ears so that she would not have to hear her mother screaming. Nicholas stabbed Dee Dee 17 times in her back while she was asleep. Well, I guess I could say while she was originally asleep, because you were not going to stay asleep when someone's stabbing you that many times. After she was dead, they had sex in Gypsy's room, which I don't think I could do that if my boyfriend just murdered my mother, but that's okay. After this, they took $4,000 in cash that Dee Dee had stashed in the house, and most of this was from like child support checks that she had saved. They fled to a motel outside of town, and they stayed there for a few days while figuring out what to do next. During this time, they were not very smart because they were spotted on multiple security cameras. However, Gypsy at this point believed that they had gotten away with the crime. No one would have suspected them, so they were safe. They could do whatever. They then, mistakenly and ridiculously, mailed the murder weapon back to Nicholas's home in Wisconsin so that they wouldn't be caught with it during their travels. Then they took a bus to Wisconsin. Multiple witnesses saw them get on this bus, and they also noticed that Gypsy was wearing a blonde wig and she was walking unassisted, so at first no one really suspected anything. After seeing a concerning Facebook status posted from Dee Dee's Facebook account, which I'm sure all of us have seen by now, the neighbors and friends of the Blanchard family suspected that something was suspicious. No one was answering the phone at the house, so friends and neighbors grouped together and went to their house. When they arrived, no one answered the door. They knew that they would often go on medical trips unannounced because they didn't really have close friends or family, so they didn't have to tell anyone where they were going. But they noticed that her car was still in the driveway, so that kind of further cemented the fact that something was fucked up here and that they did not just leave home. They couldn't really see in the windows and no one answered the door, so they called 911. When the police arrived, they had to wait for a search warrant, but they allowed one of the neighbors to climb through a window. And this neighbor saw that the house was pretty much undisturbed and that all of Gypsy's wheelchairs were still there. People were super worried because it seemed that they were both still in the house. When the warrant was signed and issued, the police entered the house and they found Dee Dee's body. A GoFundMe account was set up to pay for her funeral expenses because all of the friends and neighbors loved this family so much. And they also suspected that Gypsy would be having a funeral too. They did not suspect Gypsy of anything, but they did suspect foul play, and they thought that maybe Gypsy was kidnapped for ransom. But they knew that with all of her medications, her equipment, her wheelchair, feeding tube, everything was at home, and that they knew that something awful would happen to her, regardless if she was murdered or not. Something awful would happen to her. Aaliyah told the police what she knew about Gypsy and her little online boyfriend. She had saved printouts of some of Gypsy's posts, so that kind of concerned her. And based on this information, the police had Facebook track his IP address, and they also tracked the post to which Dee Dee's account had made the suspicious-ass post. Turns out it was Nicholas Gojohn's house in Big Bend, Wisconsin. The next day, they were there and they raided the house, and both he and Gypsy surrendered and were taken into custody on charges of murder and felony armed criminal action. Obviously, the first thing that people heard back in Springfield is that Gypsy was safe and alive and well, and she was found. So they're like, yay, she's been found, she's okay, she's gonna be brought home. Well, yeah, that's the first thing they thought. However, when they announced the news in Springfield, the sheriff warned that things are not always what they appear. Soon after everything was kind of squared away at the police department, the Springfield media reported the truth of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, that she had never been sick and she had always been able to walk. But Dee Dee had made her pretend otherwise, using physical abuse to control her. They were also urged not to donate any money to the family until investigators learned the extent of this fraud, of this insane-ass shit that's going on. So, like I said at first, everyone loved Dee Dee. They were so concerned, and they were very sympathetic that she was a victim of murder and that her child was abducted. Well, then they realized she was an abuser, so they were very sympathetic to Gypsy Rose. They felt awful that she had been such a long-term victim of child abuse. They were shocked, to say the least. In Missouri, the charge of first-degree murder can carry the death penalty or life without parole. However, the prosecutor, Dan Patterson, announced that he would not seek the death penalty for either Gypsy or Nicholas because this case was extraordinary and unusual. After her attorney received her medical records from Louisiana, he found that she indeed would have been a healthy child if her mother was not abusing her. She had no issues. He secured a plea bargain for second-degree murder for Gypsy. He also said that Gypsy was so malnourished up to this point that when she was in jail for a year, she gained 14 pounds, which doesn't seem like a lot, but he said most of his clients typically lose weight when they're in this situation eating prison food. She had been literally living off of Pediasure for 20-some years. In July of 2015, Gypsy Rose accepted the plea bargain and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Nicholas had a more severe charge because he initiated the murder plot and he was the one who actually killed Dee Dee Blanchard. Gypsy Rose did not have to testify against him. In January of 2017, his trial was postponed because they wanted to reevaluate him because he had an IQ of 82, he had autism, and they said that he has diminished capacity. They wanted to reevaluate him with the psych exam. However, by December 2017, the judge set his trial, and it was set for November of 2018. Prosecutors said that Nicholas had deliberated for over a year before the crime, and that, yes, he had autism, and that Gypsy had helped him with the crime, but this was very obviously premeditated, and this is not a crime of passion. This is not something that he did just because he was in love with Dee Dee. even a week before the murder, through text messages, him and Gypsy Rose would talk about the murder. They would talk about Dee Dee's room, how it was set up, her sleeping habits. If you can hear my cat walking over my microphone and purring, I'm sorry. He loves hanging out with me. Anyways, like I said, on text messages up to a week before the murder, they were still, like, clearly planning out this murder. Gypsy decided to testify on the trial's third day, and she testified and said that she had suggested to Nicholas that he could kill Dee Dee to end her mother's abuse, but she had also suggested that they could get pregnant and have a baby, because then Dee Dee would have to accept him. She was going to have a child with this man. Along with the knife that she had stolen from Walmart to give to Nicholas to kill Dee Dee, she also stole baby clothes, so they could use either plan, really. However, Nicholas obviously went with the murder plan and never even had a thought about the pregnancy plan. The case got sent to the jury after 4 days, and the jurors had the option of finding Nicholas guilty of one of 3 murder charges. He could be charged with involuntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, or first-degree murder, or none of them, which was unlikely. After only 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict, and Nicholas was indeed found guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. In February of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder conviction. And this is really the only possible option because the prosecutors did not want to seek the death penalty for him. Nicholas asked the judge for leniency on the armed criminal action charge, which has a minimum sentence of only 3 years. So, I mean, really it didn't matter. He was already serving life in prison for murder, but he said that he had fallen blindly in love with Gypsy and that had blurred his judgment. However, he received a sentence of 25 years on that charge, which goes again with the life sentence. The community was absolutely shocked that all of Gypsy's illnesses were made up. Aaliyah was devastated. She cried of disbelief when she heard that Gypsy had never been sick or disabled. Aaliyah's mother recalled how everyone had accepted Dee Dee's claims without asking for proof, and just wondering, like, how could I have believed this and been so stupid? It's really not her fault, which I'm sure you can sympathize with, but Dee Dee's family in Louisiana, her father and stepmother, they said that they did not regret her death. Her father, stepmother, and her nephew, who had actually first confronted her about Gypsy's health and stuff like that, said that Gypsy had already been punished as much as she needed to be, and they did not want her to pay for this crime. None of them would pay for her funeral, and ultimately they flushed her ashes down the toilet. Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's dad, was not as harsh. He said that he thinks Dee Dee's problem was that she started a web of lies and there was no escaping afterwards. He said it was like a tornado got started. He then saw a video of Gypsy Rose from the trial, and he was happy because it was the first time he saw her walking under her own power. In 2018, Gypsy Rose said, "I feel like I'm more free in prison than with living with my mom, because now I'm allowed to just live like a normal woman." Gypsy Rose married Ryan Scott Anderson while in prison on June 27th of this year, and she is eligible for parole next year. So we may have an update on Gypsy Rose. Tell me what you guys think about this case. I think it's absolutely insane. Do you think Gypsy Rose deserves her 10-year sentence? Do you think the murder is justified? Tell me what you think. I hope you guys enjoyed this case. I'll see you guys in a couple of days. And that's all for tonight. Bye, guys.